The request came at the wrong hour. Gideon had been reviewing patrol reports from the northern border when his steward knocked twice, the pattern reserved for visits that were not routine. He set the reports down. Royce entered alone, without his second, without the formal nod that preceded every other audience the Beta had ever requested. He stopped in the center of the room and looked at Gideon the way a man looks at something he has been rehearsing. "Sir," he said, "I need to ask something of you." In 30 years of service, Royce had never used that sentence. Not once. Gideon closed the folder in front of him. "Sit down." Royce sat. He placed both hands flat on his knees, and the posture alone told Gideon this was going to be the kind of conversation that could not be walked back once it started. "My daughter is dying." The words arrived without a frame around them. Royce didn't pause for effect. He said it the same way he would have reported a border incursion, direct, because there was nothing to be gained by softening the delivery. "The broken bond," he continued. "You know what it is?" Gideon had heard the term once, years ago, in a healer's account of a case that had ended badly in a border settlement. Mixed blood shifters, those born to one human and one wolf parent, carried a rare instability in the bond between the two sides of their nature. Most lived their whole lives without triggering it. In some, under certain conditions, that instability turned active. The wolf side and the human side began rejecting each other, not as illness, but as structural collapse from within. It was not painful at first, then it was nothing but. "I know it," Gideon said. "Kala developed the first signs 3 weeks ago." Royce's hands stayed flat and still. "The progression is faster than the accounts described. The healer gives her 5 to 7 weeks at the outside, possibly less now." Kala was 22. Gideon had met her twice, once at a formal court event when she was a child, once at a border council dinner 4 years ago where she had sat 2 seats down from him and spent the meal arguing territorial law with one of his senior captains. She had been right about 3 out of 4 points and had known it. "There is a cure," Royce said. "Then why are you here instead of on the road already?" "Because the cure is at Thornvale Reach." Royce said the name without emphasis, but the name carried its own weight. Thornvale Reach sat at the far edge of the eastern borderlands, past 2 unstable frontier zones and a mountain passage that ran seasonal travel in one direction only. 7 to 8 days of travel from here, through terrain that requires either significant military force or someone the zones will not challenge outright. Gideon watched him. "I can give you an escort, 12 men, full arms." "I'm not asking for an escort." The room was quiet. "I'm asking you to go," Royce said. "You're asking the Alpha King to personally escort your daughter across 2 unstable zones and a mountain passage." "Yes." Gideon waited for the reason. Royce offered none. He held the question and let the silence work. "Royce, I know what I'm asking. Then tell me why it has to be me." Something moved behind the Beta's expression, the end of a long calculation. "Because I trust you with her life," he said. "And because in 30 years I have never asked you for anything. I am asking now." It was not manipulation. Gideon understood the difference. Royce was not using the 30 years as leverage. He was naming the truth of it, that he had never called in a single thing, and this was the thing he was calling in. "The mountain passage closes in 12 days, Gideon said. "Blocked for entry on the northern face once the first heavy snow sets. The southern face stays open through winter. The return would need to come through Aldenmere Valley, which adds 2 days to the journey home." "Correct. And the direct route on the way back is not possible. The northern entry closes first and fastest. Going in, we need the direct approach. It saves 2 days we cannot spare. Coming back, we can afford the longer road." Gideon moved to the window. Below, the training yard sat empty in the afternoon, quiet. He thought about the terrain. The 2 frontier zones between here and the Reach were not sovereign territory. They were contested borderland, where a large armed column became a provocation as much as a protection. Something smaller moved differently. 4 riders, he said. Me, Kala, and 2 guard. "I cannot go myself," Royce said. My face is known in the eastern zones from the border negotiations 8 years ago. It would draw the wrong attention to the group. Varn and Dace. Yes. Gideon turned from the window. 2 days. Royce stood. Something in his face shifted. Not relief exactly, but the release of something that had been held rigid for a long time. Thank you, he said. Don't. Gideon picked up the patrol reports again. Tell me about the reach. What does the ritual require? Royce reached into his coat and set a folded document on the desk. I sourced this through a merchant who runs supply routes to the borderland settlements. He has a contact inside Thornvale territory. The records the clan shared 3 seasons ago describe the process. And the ritual realigns the bond between the wolf and human elements of the body. It can only be conducted by the Reach Elder. It requires materials the clan holds, and it requires... Royce paused for the first time in the entire conversation. It works faster and more reliably, with the subject's mate bond active. Sustained proximity to the mate over several days is the only natural accelerant the records describe. Without it, the ritual carries a 50% failure rate. Kala has a mate? Royce was quiet long enough that Gideon heard the answer before it arrived. She carries the mark, Royce said, has since childhood. I found it by accident when she was 7. He held Gideon's gaze without flinching. She has never been told. Who is her mate? Royce said nothing. The answer came on its own, in the silence, with the weight of something that had been true for a long time before anyone named it. Gideon stood very still. How long have you known? 15 years. 15 years. You would not have chosen this, Royce said. His voice did not waver, but it was not easy. A girl of mixed blood without title or rank. I knew what your answer would have been. She was a child, and I told myself the time was not right, and then she grew up, and the time was still not right, and then she became ill, and I ran out of reasons to keep waiting. Gideon looked at the document on the desk. He looked at the border reports beside it, the routes marked in faded ink, the notations about passage conditions and settlement politics along the Eastern Road. Does she know any of this? She knows she's ill. She knows there is a ritual at the Reach. She does not know about the mark. Royce paused. She believes you are coming because I traded a political favor to secure her escort. What did you tell her? Nothing she found satisfying. Gideon turned the document over in his hands and read through it again, slower this time, following the ritual specifications and the route notes with the kind of attention that delayed a decision without avoiding it. When he set it down, he did not look at the beta for a long moment. 2 days, he said finally. Royce nodded once. I'll have her ready. Kala found her father in the lower study, and she did not knock. She had been in the lower city that afternoon when the steward's message reached her. 3 lines and no explanation, which from Royce meant something she was not going to welcome. She had ridden back faster than she needed to and spent the last mile preparing arguments she already suspected would do nothing. She had not expected to dislike the news quite this much. The Alpha King, she said, pulling the door shut behind her. You asked the Alpha King to escort me personally. Royce stood at the window with his back to her. Yes. Not a company of guards. Not the 2 men who have been in your service for a decade. You walked into the palace and requested that Gideon himself travel 8 days across the eastern borderlands to deliver me to a mountain ritual. That is what I did. Kala crossed the room. She stopped close enough that he would have to look at her if he turned, and he turned. Tell me what you gave him, she said, because no one asks the Alpha King for a personal favor without an exchange, and I want to know what you traded. Nothing. Father, I asked him as a man who has served him for 30 years and never once made a personal request. His voice was measured. He agreed. That is the whole of it. She studied his face the way she had studied it her whole life, looking for the thing he was not saying. She found something, some weight sitting just behind his eyes that he was not going to name tonight. She had learned young that pushing Royce before he was ready to speak produced nothing but a polished version of silence. Her mother would have known how to pull it from him. Marit had always known how to read the gaps in what he said and walk through them without making him feel the intrusion. 3 winters gone now, taken by a fever that moved faster than anyone had anticipated. And the gap she had left was a different kind of gap. The kind neither of them had found language for yet. Calla pushed the thought back. "He is going to spend 8 days on the road resenting this obligation," she said. "And I am going to spend 8 days watching him resent it." "He won't resent it." "You're certain of that?" "More certain than you are." She held his gaze for a moment longer. The argument was finished, and they both knew it. The arrangement was made, the window was set, and refusing to go was not a choice she was willing to consider. She had seen the healer's face after the last examination. She understood what the tremors in her arm meant without needing it explained a second time. "If I die in a border zone," she said, "I want you to know that I will find a way to make it your fault from wherever I end up." Royce almost smiled. "You won't die in a border zone. You keep saying things you can't actually know." She left him at the window. 2 mornings later, Gideon was at the east gate before the sun had cleared the wall. Varn and Dace were already mounted, packs secured, wearing travel gear rather than palace livery. The horses were road animals, solid, unremarkable, built for distance rather than impression. Royce stood at the edge of the courtyard. Calla was beside him. He said something to her, brief and quiet. She nodded once without looking at him, and crossed toward the horses with a travel pack over one shoulder and the deliberate posture of someone who had decided, before arriving, how much energy she was willing to spend on ceremony. She checked her saddle herself before mounting. Then she looked up and found Gideon already watching her. He had seen her before, twice. Up close, she had her father's stillness and not his patience. Her jaw was set in a way that communicated she had already formed an opinion about how this journey was going to go and was prepared to be correct about it. His wolf registered her proximity before his mind had finished the thought. It was not the general alertness of unfamiliar ground or the trained awareness of a new variable. It was specific, pointed. It moved through him like a current below the surface of still water and then settled, waiting. He filed it away. "I don't require managing," she said. "I know the timeline. I'll keep pace." "Good," he said. She mounted. He mounted. Varn and Dace fell into position without instruction, and the group moved through the gate. The road opened ahead of them into the early gray of the morning. Behind them, the city fell back by degrees. Gideon did not look back. Beside him, Calla rode with her eyes on the distance and said nothing more. And the space between them held the particular quality of 2 people who had each already decided what the other one was. The first mile passed in silence. Then the second. The road curved east, and the palace wall disappeared, and the 8-day journey to Thornvale Reach properly began. The first frontier zone began where the King's Road stopped being maintained. The change was not marked on any boundary stone. It simply arrived, in accumulation. The road surface went from packed earth to loose stone, to a track that suggested rather than directed. The trees on either side grew closer and denser, the kind of growth that had not been managed in a generation. Varn rode ahead without being asked, his hand near his weapon, reading the undergrowth with an attention that came from years in exactly this type of territory. Calla rode without comment. She had traded her traveling cloak for a shorter riding one at the last settlement, and she wore it open despite the cold. She carried no visible weapon beyond a short blade at her hip, which she touched once at the tree line, and did not touch again. The first day through the zone passed without incident. Only distance, watchfulness, and the steady degradation of the road beneath them. The blockade appeared on the second day into the zone. They smelled it before they saw it. Or more precisely, Gideon smelled it. And from the way Calla's shoulders shifted slightly ahead of Varn's signal, she smelled it too. 3 men on the road, 2 more in the tree line left, 1 in the tree line right. Not soldiers. The arrangement was territorial, not tactical. More interested in extracting a toll than in controlling the route. Varn raised a fist. The group stopped. The man in the center of the road was broad and unhurried, carrying the air of someone who had run this blockade long enough to find it boring. He looked at 4 riders with travel packs and assessed the group with the efficiency of long repetition. Crossing fee, he said. Gideon did not answer immediately. He was counting positions. The two in the tree line had shifted since the first sighting, moving to a better angle on the road. The man speaking was not the decision-maker. He was the mouth. The decision-maker was the one who had not moved, still at the left tree line, bow at rest, but not down. The road doesn't belong to you, Dace said from the right flank. Everything in this zone belongs to someone. The man smiled. Right now, it belongs to us. Gideon calculated the road ahead. The main track ran straight and open for the next quarter mile, ideal positioning for the archers in the elevated tree line. The valley route curved south from a fork 200 yards back, longer by half a day. The valley had its own risks, but they were terrain risks, not organized ones. He was about to give the order to fall back to the fork when Kala spoke. "The mill settlement," she said quietly, to him alone. 3 miles south before the fork. My father's trade routes ran through this zone for 6 years. The settlement master there has no love for this particular group. They cost him 2 supply shipments last autumn. If we send word ahead through the valley that the mill is about to receive a visit from the Alpha King, the settlement master will have that road cleared in under 2 hours. Gideon looked at her. "His name is Aldrich Byrne," she continued. "He is practical, and he carries debts he would very much like forgiven. This group knows the main road. They do not work the valley." The man on the road took a step forward. "You discussing payment over there?" Varn's horse shifted. Dace's hand moved to his weapon. "No," Gideon said. To the man on the road. He pulled his horse right, unhurried, signaling the retreat with nothing more than direction. The group turned. Behind them, the man shouted something about reconsidering, which none of them answered. They rode back to the fork in silence. "The mill," Gideon said. "The valley path meets the southern mill track half a mile in. Byrne keeps a rider on rotation." She paused. "He will move quickly if the message carries your name directly." She was right about all of it. The rider was where she said. The message moved fast, carried on a name that opened things in the borderlands, regardless of the reason. The valley route past the mill was clear by the time they reached the far end. The blockade group did not appear. He had been about to choose a slower, blunter approach, and she had handed him a better one in 40 words, without framing it as advice, and without waiting for him to ask. The mill, the name, the debt. 3 pieces of information assembled into a clean answer while he was still assessing the problem. He had expected Royce's daughter. He had not revised what that meant precisely enough. They made camp at the edge of the valley as the light failed. Varn took first watch. Dace set the fire. Kala sat with her back to the tree line, and for a moment Gideon caught her looking at her left arm with a look that was brief and clinical, the look of someone checking a result they already anticipated. The skin below her left wrist had changed, not bruising. Something closer to a shadow sitting beneath the surface, as if the tissue itself had shifted temperature. The mark ran 2 inches along the inner forearm and ended cleanly, and she held that wrist still with a deliberate quality that required active effort. Then she pulled her sleeve down and reached for her pack with her right hand. He said nothing. She had not invited a question, and she had been precise enough about the sleeve that she knew he had seen it. She was not hiding it. She was filing it. His wolf was not filing anything. Since the blockade, since before the blockade, if he was honest about the timing, the animal side of his awareness had been running a pull he could not redirect. It was not threat response. Threat response had a direction and resolved when the threat resolved. This was different. A fixed, returning attention that oriented toward the rider on his left and came back there every time he moved it elsewhere, with the patience of something that had found its orientation and did not intend to give it up. He attributed it to terrain variables. Unfamiliar zone, understaffed group, civilian with a deteriorating condition. The context warranted elevated attention. He ate. He reviewed the route. He slept 4 hours and took the last watch before dawn without incident. The third day brought a different stretch of ground and a different problem. The valley narrowed past the mill settlement, the tree cover thinning into scrub and exposed ridge rock. By mid-morning, they were on an elevated track with open sight lines in all directions, which also meant open sight lines to them from all directions. Gideon spotted the renegade before the others. Downwind, moving wrong, not ranging for prey, not running a route. The low, deliberate tracking movement of something that had picked up a specific scent and was following it with focus. His scent, carried from the night camp on the shifting ridge wind. Alpha King, without banner or retinue, was still Alpha King to a wolf that had spent long enough in ungoverned territory to stop calculating consequences correctly. Lone renegades made that mistake when the opportunity appeared to outweigh the risk. "Renegade," Varn said from the rear, half a mile back, working downwind. "I see it." Dace moved to the left flank without instruction. Varn held the rear. The track ahead ran straight and exposed for 400 yards before a sharp bend. Past the bend, the ridge dropped into a wider path with natural cover, defensible ground. The problem was the open stretch before it. Kala had gone still beside him. Not the stillness of someone who had not noticed. The stillness of someone using more than sight to build the picture. "It's going to rush before the bend," she said. Not a question. "Most likely. Then I want to try something." The same tone as the mill. Information, not a request. A partial shift. The scent release breaks a tracking pattern. A renegade following a single target will recalculate when a second scent appears without warning. It might create enough disruption to make the bend without a full engagement. Gideon looked at her. He did not need the healer's records to understand what a partial shift cost a wolf with the broken bond. The condition was precisely the rejection between those two elements, and forcing the bridge was, the word Royce's contact had used, was destabilizing. "That will move the progression," he said. "Yes, there are other options. Fewer good ones on this section than there were in the valley." She was still watching the scrub below the ridge. "I can do it." The renegade made the decision before they finished the conversation. It came off the ridge fast and low, committing to the rush at the worst point in the track, which meant it had a better read on the terrain than they had estimated. Varn wheeled to intercept. Dace broke right. Kala shifted. It was not a clean shift. It caught and arrested partway through, her spine snapping forward in the saddle as the horse shied hard, and what emerged was incomplete. The change taking the lower half of her face, one shoulder, stopping there and holding at the seam between wolf and human, like something jammed in a mechanism. But the scent released was wolf, sharp and immediate, and the renegade broke pattern exactly as she had said. It checked the rush, swerved, tried to recalculate direction, and Varn hit it full force from the left flank, driving it off the track and into the scrub with enough impact that it did not immediately find its feet. It did not return. They made the bend. Gideon kept the pace until they reached cover, then slowed. The reverse shift was worse than the first. It took longer than it should have, and when it finished, Kala sat with both hands on the pommel, and the color of her face had gone wrong. Not pale, but unevenly drained, as if something beneath the surface had been disturbed. Gideon pulled alongside. She was already looking at her arm. The shadow mark had darkened and extended, past the edge where it had stopped before, running further toward the crook of her elbow, visibly changed. She looked at it for a moment without speaking. Then she looked up. "I know," she said, before he could form the question. "I felt it move." "How much time did you lose?" She considered it honestly. "I had more time this morning than I have now. That's the most accurate thing I can tell you." She rolled her left shoulder once, testing the range, set her hands back on the reins, and looked at the road ahead rather than at him. "We keep going," she said. "We don't have the margin to stop early." He did not argue. They made the second camp at the base of the ridge, where the scrub gave way to a stand of older trees and the ground leveled. Better cover. Varn and Dace set the perimeter without instruction. Kala ate without comment. She checked her arm twice during the meal, both times briefly, both times with the sleeve pushed back just far enough to see the edge of the mark. The second time she let the sleeve fall and did not check again. Gideon watched the fire. His wolf had not settled since the ridge. The pull that had started at the blockade was different now. More deliberate in the way it returned his attention to her, less willing to accept redirection. He gave it a direction to work with, the perimeter, the dark between the trees, the distance and the terrain still ahead. It returned to her. Every time. The tremor came an hour after the meal. Calla was sitting still, not exerting herself, not reaching for anything, not under any visible physical stress. Her left arm simply began shaking from the elbow down with a steady, rhythmic movement that had no external cause. It ran for 30 seconds and did not stop when she pressed her right hand over it. It stopped on its own. During those 30 seconds, her face was completely clear. Not composed, clear. The expression of someone who had prepared for this specific thing and was simply waiting for it to finish. When it stopped, she set her arm across her knee with a careful pressure that absorbed the last of the movement. She looked up. Across the fire, Gideon was already looking at her. Neither of them spoke. She lay down with her back to the fire. He stayed where he was, watching the dark at the edge of the trees. The tremor had come without a trigger. Every previous episode had followed effort. The tactic at the blockade, the shift on the ridge. Tonight she had been sitting still. She had understood what it meant before her arm had stopped moving. He had seen it in her face. They were losing time faster than the schedule allowed, and the fire burned low between them, and the night settled over the camp without asking anyone's permission. The bifurcation came on the fourth morning, where the main road split into two branches that would not meet again until the far side of the mountain range. Varn pulled the map from his pack and spread it across his saddle without being asked. The left branch ran through the Aldenmere checkpoint, a formal frontier post with papers, records, travel documentation. 4 riders with no official passage documents would draw the kind of attention that cost time they did not have. The right branch was the mountain passage itself, direct and fast, and currently open in one direction only. "Varn and I take the checkpoint," Dace said. He was reading the map over Varn's shoulder. "We present your seal, give the right names, clear the post legitimately. No one questions 2 guards on official business. And we meet on the other side," Varn said. "There's a way station settlement, Calwick. Half a day past the passage exit. We wait there." Gideon looked at the passage branch. The track rose sharply into the gray, climbing toward rock and cloud cover and whatever the weather had been doing up there for the past 2 days without anyone watching. 2 days of that, alone with Calla, no checkpoint friction, no cover story, and a timeline that was already running shorter than it had been at departure. "We'll reach Calwick by the end of the 2nd day," he said. "Be there." Varn folded the map. "We'll be there." They separated at the fork, without ceremony. Varn and Dace took the left branch, and the horses' hooves faded into the distance. Gideon and Calla took the right branch, and the road immediately began to climb. The passage was not dangerous in the way the frontier zones had been dangerous. There were no men waiting in tree lines, no organized groups working the route. The danger here was simpler and less negotiable. Altitude, exposure, and a sky that had been building something gray and heavy since before noon. Calla rode ahead of him for the first stretch, the track being narrow enough to require single file, and he watched her manage the terrain without complaint. Her horse was steady. She was steady on it. She had the particular stillness in the saddle of someone who had spent real time on the road and not just in palace training yards, and he noted it the same way he had been noting things about her since the valley. Without deciding what to do with the information, because the information did not yet have an obvious destination. His wolf tracked her with the same fixed attention it had been running since the blockade. He had stopped trying to redirect it. The first snow came in the early afternoon. Not the heavy closing snow, light, dry, the kind that said the heavy snow was behind it and moving with purpose. Gideon looked at the sky and calculated the window, and concluded they were not going to reach the passage exit before the weather made the choice for them. "We need shelter," he said, when she had pulled alongside him at a wider section of track. She looked at the sky and came to the same conclusion without requiring an explanation. The passage maps show a shepherd's station at the first ridge plateau, another 2 hours of climb. Can you make 2 hours? She looked at him with an expression that was not quite irritation. Ask me something more useful than that. They made 2 hours. The shepherd's station was a low stone structure built into the ridge wall, small and cold and entirely abandoned for the season. But the roof held and the door latched, and there was a stack of old fuel beside a narrow hearth that burned without protest when Gideon lit it. Calla checked her arm while he worked the fire. She was standing near the single window, her back partially to him, but the angle of her shoulders told him what she was doing. When she turned back into the room, the sleeve was already down. "The mark?" he said, holding. She sat on the floor near the hearth, close enough for the heat, far enough to leave room. "It has not moved since the ridge camp, which is either good news or my standard of measurement has simply shifted." He settled on the opposite side of the hearth, with his back against the stone wall. Outside, the snow was no longer light. It moved against the shutters with a new weight, and the wind had found its register, the one that meant hours rather than minutes. They were not going anywhere until morning. The first hour passed in the way that first hours in unfamiliar confined spaces tended to pass, each of them managing their own corner of the room, the fire doing most of the communicating. Calla produced dried meat and hard bread from her pack and ate without offering commentary. He ate from his own supplies. The wind outside established a rhythm and held it. His wolf was present in a way that had no precedent in his experience. Not aggressive, not agitated, simply attentive with a fullness that had no off position, oriented toward the woman 3 feet away, with the absolute certainty of something that had been waiting a long time and had finally arrived at the right place. It pressed against the inside of his control, the way pressure pressed against a door, not forcing, just making its presence known. He focused on the fire. Calla had pulled her knees up and was looking at the middle distance between the hearth and the wall, her face carrying the distant focus of someone running a calculation she had not yet finished. After a while, she shifted her weight slightly, not toward him and not away, just a resettlement of position. "How long have you been Alpha King?" she said. It was not a question about the road. He had asked nothing that led to it. She had been watching him long enough and carefully enough to choose that specific thing to ask, which meant she had been forming the question for a while and had decided this was the moment to use it. 11 years, he said. "You were young. 22. She considered that. My age now. Yes. She looked at the fire. "Were you ready?" The question was direct in the way her questions tended to be direct, not aggressive, not probing for weakness, genuinely wanting the answer. He thought about the honest response, which was not the one he gave in courts and councils, and gave it. "No," he said. "I understood the responsibilities. I did not understand the weight of them until I was carrying it, and by then there was no practical use in the understanding." "What changed?" "What do you mean?" "You said you understood the responsibilities before you took the position. What changed that you didn't anticipate?" He was quiet for a moment. "The permanence of decisions," he said. "When I was studying rule, every problem had a correct solution if you applied enough thought. After, the thought was the same, the solutions were often the same, but the decisions did not end. Each one opened the next one. I had not understood that part completely." She absorbed this without the performance of having absorbed it. No nod, no murmured agreement. She simply took it in and held it. "Your father ruled before you," she said. "He died when I was 19. Mine has served since before I was born." She pulled at a loose thread on her sleeve cuff. "There are days I think he finds his purpose so completely in the service that he does not always remember what is outside it." It was not quite a complaint. It was a careful observation from someone who had spent years making careful observations about a person she could not be fully critical of. He recognized the architecture of it, the way people talked about things they had made a certain peace with without the peace being total. "He asked me for something he has never asked for in 30 years, Gideon said. It was not a reassurance. It was information, offered because it was relevant. She looked at him. Something in her expression shifted, not softening, but the adjustment that happened when a piece of data arrived that changed the picture without completing it. He still didn't tell me why, she said. No. He had a reason. He did. She waited, but he did not fill the space, and after a moment she returned her gaze to the fire. The silence that followed was different from the silence of the first hour. It had content in it, the kind that accumulated between people who had each put something real on the table and were taking stock of what the other one had set down. The wind hit the shutters with a sharp gust and then eased. The fire settled lower. Gideon added 2 pieces of the old fuel from the stack, and the flame rebuilt itself without drama. The tremors, he said. Not a question, a subject being opened. Kala was quiet for a beat. What about them? The first ones required effort to trigger. The one at the second camp did not. I want to understand what that progression means for the timeline. She was quiet for longer this time. He had the sense she was deciding how much of the honest answer she was willing to say out loud, because saying it out loud made it more real than keeping it inside the calculation where she had been managing it privately. The spontaneous ones mean the rejection is no longer waiting for stress to activate it, she said. It's running on its own schedule now, which means the window the healer gave me, 5 to 7 weeks, was based on a progression that was slower than what I'm currently experiencing. How much slower? I don't know. I don't have enough points of reference. She pulled her sleeve up, just enough, and looked at the mark on her inner forearm without expression. The shadow had not moved since the ridge camp, but the edge of it was sharper than it had been, more defined. If we reach the reach on schedule, it will be close. Define close. She pulled the sleeve down. Close enough that I would rather not spend time defining it. He accepted that. She was not being evasive. She genuinely did not have the information, and presenting uncertainty as certainty was not something she appeared willing to do in either direction. We will reach the reach on schedule, he said. She looked at him. The directness of the statement seemed to catch her slightly off balance, not because she doubted it, but because she had not expected it to arrive without qualification. You don't know that, she said. No, he agreed. But I have made harder timetables hold on worse terrain, and I have not lost a civilian under my protection in 11 years of this position. I am not a civilian under your protection, she said. I am a woman you were maneuvered into escorting. The destination is the same regardless of the reason I'm going. She held his gaze for a moment. Something in her face moved, not quite humor, but the cousin of it. The first time he had seen that particular expression, and it arrived and departed quickly, but it was real. Fair, she said. The fire held. Outside, the snow continued its work, indifferent to timelines and distances, and the 2 people sitting on opposite sides of a shepherd's hearth at altitude, who had arrived at the conversation without planning to, and had said more into it than either of them had intended. Gideon took the first watch at the door while Kala slept. His wolf ran its fixed attention in the direction of the sleeping figure by the hearth, and he stood at the door and watched the snow move against the dark and let it run. When she woke and told him to sleep, he did, and the wolf settled to something that was not quite quiet, but was at least still. The storm cleared before dawn. They were moving by the time the sky showed gray, the track ahead swept clean by the wind and the surface firm under new snow that had packed rather than drifted. Kala rode beside him now. The track had widened past the shepherd's station, and the distance between their horses was smaller than it had been on the way up, which neither of them commented on, and neither of them corrected. The passage exit appeared in the early afternoon, the mountain opening onto a downward slope and the lower valley spreading below them. Calwick sat at the base of the slope, a modest way station settlement with smoke rising from 3 chimneys and 2 horses tied outside the main building that Gideon recognized before he was close enough to see Varn and Dace themselves. They were there, on schedule. He felt something in his chest release that he had not fully acknowledged was held. Kala saw the horses at the same moment, and the set of her shoulders changed, not much, but enough. She had been carrying the mountain passage and the timeline and the progression of the mark and the honest uncertainty of the answer she had given him at the hearth, and the sight of two familiar horses outside a way station at the base of a clean trail was a small, concrete, reliable thing. She did not comment on it, but she rode toward it without slowing, and he rode beside her, and the last 2 days on the mountain stayed where they had been built, which was in the space between them where the distance used to be. They stayed at Calwick only long enough to water the horses, eat something hot, and confirm what the weather had already decided for them. The passage had cost them less time than Gideon had feared, but not enough to erase the distance still between Calwick and Thornvale Reach. They took rooms for the night, left again at first light, and spent the next day on the lower eastern road through cedar country and river crossings shallow enough to take it a walk. That night, at the final camp before the Reach, Calla checked the mark once in the firelight. It had not advanced since the mountain. Neither of them pretended the pause meant safety. It meant only that the road had not taken more than it already had, and that the last stretch now depended on endurance more than strategy. By the 8th morning, the valley had begun to draw inward around them, the road narrowing under older trees and the air taking on the quiet pressure of territory claimed a long time ago and never truly surrendered. Thornvale Reach sat at the end of a valley that felt less like a destination and more like the result of the land folding in on itself deliberately. The trees on either side of the final approach were old enough that their canopy closed overhead, and the light that made it through arrived in pieces. The settlement, if it could be called that, was a series of low stone structures arranged without obvious pattern, connected by paths that had been worn rather than planned. No walls, no gate, no visible guards. What it had instead was presence, a quality in the air that the wolf part of Gideon registered as significant before the thinking part had processed the details. Old territory, old claim, the kind of place that had been inhabited and tended and understood for long enough that the land itself had taken on the character of the people in it. Varn and Dace pulled up at the tree line without instruction, reading the boundary the same way Gideon read it. Ritual territory, the kind that did not benefit from extra bodies. The outer shelter, Gideon said to Varn, nodding toward a structure at the edge of the tree line that had the look of a way station. Basic, functional, meant for travelers waiting on something. Stay there. I'll send word when we're done. Varn nodded once. He looked at Calla briefly, assessing the mark on her arm without staring at it. And then he and Dace turned toward the shelter. Gideon and Calla rode the last 100 yards alone. Emmerich was waiting at the entrance to the central structure. He was not what Gideon had expected, which was a thing he acknowledged silently and did not show. Emmerich was old in the way that certain things were old, not diminished by it, but concentrated. He was short, narrow-shouldered, with hands that looked like they had been doing the same specific work for decades and had shaped themselves around it. He watched them approach with the unhurried attention of someone who had made a decision about the situation before they arrived and was simply waiting for it to confirm. His gaze moved to Calla first. He read her arm. The mark was visible, the sleeve having slipped during the final approach, with the efficiency of a man reading something he already knew was going to be on the page. Then he looked at Gideon. Whatever he found there, he did not name it. He held the look for one long, specific moment, the look of someone who had been given information in advance and was now checking it against the real thing. And then he stepped back from the entrance. "Come in," he said. "We have time, but not much of it." The interior was one room, larger than the exterior suggested, with a stone table at the center and shelves along every wall holding vessels and materials that Gideon did not have the vocabulary to categorize. A second person moved in the far corner, a younger woman, an assistant, who did not look up from what she was preparing. Emmerich gestured toward the table. Calla sat on the edge of it without being asked to. She had been reading the room from the doorway. "Show me the arm," Emmerich said. She pushed the sleeve up to the elbow. The shadow mark had stabilized in the past 2 days. Not retreated, but holding its edge with the same sharpness Gideon had noted at the shepherd's station. Emmerich examined it with both hands, not touching the skin directly, moving his fingers in the space just above the mark in a reading motion. "The active rejection is 3 weeks advanced from initial onset," he said. He was speaking to the room, not specifically to either of them. The partial shift accelerated the internal timeline. "We can work with what's here, but the ritual cannot be delayed past tonight." "We understand," Calla said. "Good." Emmerich stepped back and picked up a small vessel from the nearest shelf. "I will explain the process as we go. 3 stages. The first 2 I conduct. The third requires something else." He paused, measuring a careful quantity from the vessel into a clay bowl. "It requires your mate." The room went still. Not the stillness of the valley approach, which had been environmental. This was a different kind, produced by 2 people simultaneously receiving information that their bodies processed faster than their minds did. Gideon did not speak. Calla did not speak. Emmerich continued preparing the bowl with the same unhurried attention he had brought to everything else, as if he had said a thing of moderate interest rather than a thing that had just rewritten the last 8 days. "The broken bond is a rejection between 2 elements of the same body," he said. "The ritual realigns them. The first stage opens the pathway. The second creates the conditions for alignment. The third requires an anchor, a sustained, deliberate connection through the mate bond, which introduces a stabilizing external reference point for the 2 elements to reorganize around." He set the bowl down and looked up. "The anchor must be the true mate. No substitute holds." Calla's voice, when it came, was controlled in the way that things were controlled when the control was actively effortful. "You're saying Gideon is my mate. I'm saying the mark on your arm has been pointing at him since you were a child." Emmerich said it without apology and without ceremony. "I assumed you both knew. I apologize for the assumption." "She did not know," Gideon said. "Royce told me there was a mark. He did not tell her, and he did not tell me what arriving here would mean." "I see that." Emmerich looked at him with the expression of a man who had watched this particular discovery happen in this room before and understood that nothing he could add would be useful. "The ritual still needs to proceed tonight. The window." "I know the window," Calla said. The assistant had stopped moving in the far corner. She had the focused stillness of someone pretending not to be present in a room where something significant was happening. Gideon looked at Calla. She was sitting very still on the edge of the stone table, with her arm extended and the shadow mark visible, her face working through something at a speed that did not show on the surface, but showed in the tension below the jaw, in the quality of her breathing. He had arrived at this room knowing one part of the answer, that Royce had known about the mark, had made the choice he made because of it, had orchestrated the journey with full understanding of what it meant. What he had not known was the specific weight of arriving at it in front of a stranger, with no space and no time, and a woman on a stone table whose arm was marking out the hours they had left. "What does the third stage require specifically?" he said. Emmerich described it without embellishment. "Physical contact, sustained. Hands, primarily. The mate bond would do the actual work once the first 2 stages had prepared the pathway, but the contact was the mechanism that activated it. It was not complicated in its physical requirements. The complexity was not in the physical requirements. And if the anchor is not present," Calla said, "the 50% failure rate." "Correct." She looked at Gideon. The look was not a question. She had too much information about him by now to genuinely ask whether he was going to stay. She was doing something else, something closer to an acknowledgement. The particular acknowledgement of someone who has just realized they are in a situation they did not agree to enter and is deciding how to carry it anyway. "Then we proceed," she said. The first stage took half an hour. Emmerich worked with the materials from the vessels, applying them to the mark on Calla's arm in a specific sequence while speaking in a low, steady rhythm that was not quite address and not quite song. The shadow mark shifted during this, not retreating, but changing texture, the edges losing their sharpness, and the whole area becoming slightly luminescent in a way that put Gideon's wolf on high alert without triggering aggression. Old working, older than anything he had personally encountered. He stood to the side of the room and watched and let the wolf register what it needed to register. Calla held still throughout. She watched Emmerich hands with the focused attention she brought to everything, reading, cataloging what she was experiencing against what she had been told to expect. Once she inhaled sharply when Emmerich pressed 2 fingers to the center of the mark, with more pressure than the preceding movements. She did not otherwise indicate discomfort. The second stage was shorter and required her to lie flat on the stone table with her eyes closed. Gideon moved without instruction to the head of the table, not touching her, simply positioned within her peripheral awareness. The wolf had been pulling toward her since they walked through the door. In this proximity, with the ritual working actively on the bond infrastructure that ran between them, the pull had a different quality, less directional, more structural, something settling into its correct alignment. He stayed where he was and let it settle. When the second stage completed, Emmerich stepped back and nodded at Gideon once. Gideon moved to the side of the table. Calla opened her eyes. She looked at the ceiling for a moment, and then turned her head and looked at him. And the look had in it everything they had not said at the shepherd's station, and everything that had been in the silence at the second camp, and everything that had been building since the valley. The whole accumulation of 8 days of careful attention, now suddenly and irrevocably named. "Third stage," she said. He sat beside her on the table edge and took her left hand in both of his. The contact landed differently than any contact in his experience. His wolf did not move toward it. His wolf had already been in that place for days, waiting. What moved was something deeper. The part of him underneath the wolf and underneath the king and underneath 11 years of learned control. It recognized, with a completeness and an absence of doubt that he had no vocabulary for, it recognized. Calla's breath changed. A slight deepening, a small release of something held for a long time. The shadow mark had begun to change from the first stage, but now it changed differently. The luminescence spread past the edges of the mark and then, gradually and without drama, began to clear. The shadow retreating inward, the skin returning to its original surface. The sensation of her through the bond arrived like sound after silence. He had not known the bond was open until it was fully open, and the difference was total. What came through first was not emotion in the ordinary sense. It was her. The specific quality of her attention, the precision, the focus, and underneath those, quieter, the fear she had not once let anyone see. The fear was passing. He felt it pass, felt the grip of it loosen as the mark cleared and the broken bond completed its resolution. And the relief that replaced it arrived through the bond with a totality that reached the part of him that had recognized her and confirmed everything that part had known. His hands stayed where they were. Her hand had closed around his at some point during the process. Emmerich spoke. Something practical about completion. Something about the next several hours. Gideon heard it and retained it. Calla looked down at their hands. The mark on her inner forearm was gone. The skin was clean. She looked at it for a long moment with the expression of someone verifying something they did not quite trust yet, and then she looked up at him. Neither of them had language for what the last hour had produced. The room held the quiet of something completed, the stillness of a process that had been running for a long time and had finally arrived at its intended end, and they sat with it without attempting to name it. They left Thornvale Reach the following morning. Emmerich had given Calla the rest of the previous day and the night, sleep, food, the simple administration of time to let the body understand that the thing fighting inside it had stopped. She had used all of it without protest, which told Gideon more about how depleted she had been than anything she had said during the journey. He spent the evening with Varn and Dace at the outer shelter. The ritual had succeeded. They were leaving at dawn by the Aldenmere Valley route, longer than the passage, lower ground, fully transitable through winter. 2 extra days on the road, but the northern passage face had closed and there was no arguing with seasonal geography. Varn nodded. Dace asked one question about the timeline, received the answer, and asked no further questions. In the morning, Calla came out of the clan's guest structure with her pack over one shoulder and her left sleeve pushed up to the elbow, the inner forearm bare and unmarked in the early light. She looked at it once while she walked to her horse, not checking, just confirming, and then mounted and did not look at it again. They rode out of Thornvale Reach in the same formation as the ride in. The valley closed behind them, the old trees taking back the light, and the reach became distance. The Aldenmere Valley route moved south before it moved west, following the lower river road through terrain that was wider and flatter than anything they had traveled on the way in. Farmland at intervals, small settlements, the kind of countryside that had been managed rather than survived. Calla rode beside him for most of the first day without speaking, and the silence had nothing uncomfortable in it. It was not the transactional silence of the first day out of the palace. It was the silence of two people who had run out of things to prove to each other and had not yet assembled the vocabulary for what came next. The bond ran its quiet, settled current between them. The urgency of it resolved now that the third stage had completed, but the presence of it unchanged. He was aware of her the way he had been aware of her since the ritual room, in a specific physical way that had no precedent. A new register of information, learning to coexist alongside everything else. On the second afternoon, she said, "My mother would have found this entire situation completely predictable." He looked over. She was watching the road ahead. "How so?" he said. "She had a theory that my father's version of love was logistical, that he expressed care the same way he managed a border problem, by identifying the structural issue and resolving it without announcing himself." She pulled her riding cloak tighter against the river wind. She found it maddening, and she also found it completely reliable, and she spent 20 years deciding which of those things to weight more heavily. What did she conclude? "She never told me directly." A pause. "She died 3 winters ago. Fever. It moved faster than the healer anticipated." She said it with the plain acknowledgement of something that had settled into the permanent geography of her life. "She would have been curious about you. She had a particular interest in people who carried large positions without letting the position carry them instead. I am not certain I always managed that. You managed it in the frontier zones." She glanced at him sideways. "You listened to information from a source you had not assessed as useful yet. That is not a thing positions make easy." He did not answer, because the answer would have been something more honest than he was ready to deliver from horseback on a river road. He filed it. She let it sit where it landed and watched the water. The capital's walls appeared on the horizon on the third afternoon, and Royce was at the gate when they arrived. He was standing at the edge of the courtyard rather than the center of it. He had been outside for a while. The traveling cloak over court dress said so. He had known the return timing within half a day and had been waiting. He looked at Calla first. He looked at her arm, the bare forearm, the clean skin. And something in his face changed in a way that Gideon had seen Royce's face change approximately twice in 30 years. He collected himself in the next breath, but it had been there. Calla met her father's eyes. She did not move toward him. She held the look for a moment and then turned her attention to Varn, who was managing the horses, and the deliberate redirection was its own kind of answer. Royce looked at Gideon. "My study," Gideon said. 1 hour. Royce nodded once. He arrived in 57 minutes. Gideon stood at the window and let Royce stand in the center of the room. "You knew from the beginning," Gideon said. "From the morning I made the request. Yes. You knew what the ritual required. You knew who she was to me. You built the entire situation with that knowledge and did not tell me any part of it." "Yes?" Royce held the word steadily. "If I had told you, you would not have gone. You do not know that." "I know you," Royce said. "I have known you since you were 19 years old and held a throne room 2 sizes too large for you by will alone. I know how you weigh what your position permits. If I had walked in here and said, 'Your mate is my daughter, she is dying, the ritual requires you specifically,' you would have sent your best company and found every reason it could not be you." He did not look away. "I did not have a better option. You had honesty. Honesty had a 50% chance of killing her." The room held that. Gideon looked at the city through the window. The rooftops, The smoke, the particular gray gold of late afternoon light on stone that he had been looking at from this window for 11 years. The anger was real. Under it was something that did not have a clean name. A recognition that the man in the center of his study had spent 15 years carrying information that could have reshaped everything and had carried it alone, with the silence Royce applied to everything he decided was his to bear. The same silence that had served the crown reliably for 3 decades. The same silence that had nearly cost his daughter her life when the weight of it became unsustainable. "I am not going to tell you the choice was wrong," Gideon said finally. "I am telling you that what it cost is not finished. The account between us has changed. That takes time." Royce absorbed this without flinching. "I understand. Go talk to your daughter." Royce left. Calla found her father in the lower study an hour later. He gave her all of it. The afternoon she was 7 years old, the fall from the garden branch, the mark visible on her arm when her sleeve rode up, faint then, barely a shadow. The weeks of records afterward, the conclusion arrived at alone. The decision to wait until she was older, then until the time was right, then the time never becoming right because there was always a reason it wasn't yet. The fear that underlined everything, not of the mark, but of a father who knew exactly how his king thought about duty and rank, who had looked at his daughter and decided the risk of a rejection she would never recover from outweighed the risk of silence. Then, 3 weeks ago, the healer's report, the ritual records from the merchant's contact in Thornvale, the condition attached to the cure. He told her everything and did not frame it as apology and did not ask for absolution. He laid the facts down in the order they had happened and let her do what she would with them. She sat across from him at the low table and listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet long enough for the fire to burn down, a visible amount. "You kept it because you were protecting me," she said. "Yes, and because you did not trust me to carry it." He did not answer immediately. The pause was the honest answer. "You were a child when I found it," he said. "I was not a child for most of those 15 years. No," he held her gaze. "You were not." Calla looked at her arm. The skin was clean. The bond ran its quiet, steady current, present in the way that new facts of geography were present. Her mother would have had something to say about all of it, something clear and delivered without cruelty, the way Marit had delivered most things. She had always been better at the difficult conversations than either of them, and her absence sat in the room the way it had been sitting in rooms between them for 3 winters. Not loudly, but without any possibility of being forgotten. "I am not going to forgive you tonight," Calla said. "I am not going to tell you what I will do with this later because I do not know yet. I am not asking you to decide tonight." "Good," she stood. "The outcome was what you intended. That is not the same as the method being acceptable, and I need you to understand that I know the difference." She paused at the door. "I am glad I am alive. I am glad the ritual worked. I am glad he came." She left him at the table. Gideon found her in the eastern courtyard at dusk, sitting on the low wall that overlooked the training yard. Her arms on her knees, face toward the last of the light. She did not startle when she heard his approach. He sat beside her on the wall. Not at the distance of the first morning out of the gate. Not at any of the measured distances of the road. The distance that had been there since the shepherd's station and had not changed since. They sat for a while without speaking. Below them, the training yard was empty. The city beyond the walls sent up its evening sounds. "How was your conversation with Royce?" she said. "Honest." "Mine too." A pause. "He told me everything." "I know." She looked at the last light on the horizon. "We are not resolved," she said. "Not as complaint, as inventory." "No," he agreed. "There are decisions ahead. About what this is. About what you permit yourself. Those are not small decisions." "They are not," he said. "I have learned more than once in the last 8 days that I make better decisions when I take the time they require rather than the time that happens to be available." The corner of her mouth moved. The same expression from the shepherd's station, less restrained now, more itself. "That is the most diplomatic thing you have said to me since we left the palace," she said. "I have been practicing." She looked at him. The light was almost gone, and the courtyard had gone to shadow, and the bond ran its quiet current underneath everything else. And the 8 days of the road were behind them, and neither of them was going anywhere. "Then we take the time," she said. "Yes," he said, "we take the time." The city settled into its evening below them, and the wall was cold, and neither of them moved to leave.